Welcome everybody to our third episode of conscious parenting. So far we've looked at the concept of conscious parenting, given a little bit of an explanation around that. Last week we spoke about parenting with a deficit, and today we're going to be talking about boundaries and discipline. So my name is Tammy, and I'm from Women of Inspiration, platform I created on Facebook, just to create support for women in all the various roles that we, have to encompass in our everyday lives. And obviously bringing talks like this is just part of facilitating that process, bringing information we need as parents especially. And so today I've got with me Isolet Jansen again. So Isolet, I know the ladies have, if they've been watching these videos, they already know who you are, but so let's just give them a short intro and then we can start.
Yes, thank you, Tammy. Isolet from Aquila practice in Blaubergstrand. And we are counseling and mediation and training practices, providing holistic support for families.
Okay. So can I kick off with my intro?
You may do so.
So just from my side, I just want to share, discipline and boundaries, we know is very important for our children. We also need to know that whatever we are putting in place needs to be age appropriate. And, I just want to say, from the off as well, that boundaries are super important for kids. And I listened to a podcast years ago, and it really stuck with me, where they did an experiment with children playing on a field. And these children were playing on a field. There was no fence around the field. And so they observed what the children would do in this big open space. And what happened is the children all seemed to congregate around the middle of the field, around each other. They played in the center and they wouldn't go to the perimeter of the field. So a follow-up to this was putting them in a field with a fence, where the field was fenced in and the children explored the whole perimeter of that field. And so this determined that the children felt much safer having that boundary of the fence in place. And so they also looked at this experiment in terms of attachment, and that sort of thing, how safe children feel. And so the thing is, we need to understand that boundaries make our children feel safe. It gives them a limit. It makes things predictable for them. They understand where something starts, where something stops. So that's super important. And then when we look at discipline, and we mentioned this in our last talk, is that there's a difference between discipline and punishment. Discipline is there for training. We train our children through discipline. Punishment is not going to bring much training. It might bring a obedience, but it's fear that will bring that obedience. So we get two types of parenting, right? We're going to parent with power, or we're going to parent with authority. Now, when we parent with power, it brings fear, right? Which is not going to be conducive. And so children that are parented with power, more likely, studies have shown that when they reach adulthood, they are not going to reach out to you as a parent for advice or help or that sort of thing, because they are going to remember that fear that's linked to that power parenting. But when you parent with authority, and last week we touched on those parenting styles, when you parent with authority, they're more likely to show respect. They are more likely to be obedient out of their own versus a forced obedience. And so even into adulthood, those children are more likely to come to their parents for advice, for assistance in time of need. So it's very important to understand this. And I know we'll probably touch on these things. And then as we also get into discipline, it's to understand, what is defiance, what is disobedience, and to understand the difference between those, and also then age appropriately, right? What is appropriate for our child at a certain age. So, Isolet, you can start off. I'll give over to you.
Yes. So the first part, or first thing that I'd like to start with, is boundaries. And boundaries, as you so beautifully explained, is there to keep us safe. And boundaries are so important, not just for our children, but for us ourselves as well. I think when we look at people who suffer from burnout, are those who struggle with their personal boundaries. And we need to be good with our boundaries with our children as well. So our children also need to understand what our boundaries are. And I recently listened to a podcast about boundaries, and it was so beautifully explained that, you know, boundaries belong to yourself. It belongs to you. It is your responsibility to put those boundaries down and to enforce them, and to remind others of your boundaries. It would be nice if others remember our boundaries, or always remember our boundaries. But if we had to remember the boundaries of everybody we engage with, it is a lot. But it is our responsibility to lovingly remind others of what our boundaries are. So that's a good way to kick us off, because in setting our boundaries, it is important that we have clear communication. So we need to understand exactly what it is that we are setting, how we are setting our boundary. You know, what is the perimeter of our boundary? And we have to communicate that clearly. And it's also, if we keep changing the border of those boundaries, it also doesn't help those that we engage with. You know, eventually, if you keep changing the boundary, people are going to be unsure, and especially your children are going to feel very insecure, because today it's okay for me to do certain things, and tomorrow it's not okay. And they're not able to discern, you know, when it is because you're having a bad day, or now that you're having a good day, now it's okay for me to jump on the couches scenario. So the next thing that I've just spoken about, so that is the consistency. So we have to be consistent. And sometimes boundaries require a little bit of negotiation, because there are going to be instances where our boundaries clash with other friends or family, or even co-workers' boundaries. So then we need to negotiate a little bit, or perhaps move the boundary fence a little bit to accommodate those around us. And then, of course, leading by example as a parent, to show our children how this works, and then to do it with empathy. So we need to understand that, and we need to teach our children, yes, a boundary is important, but we also have to be attuned to their needs, and especially their emotional needs. And there are going to be instances where our child needs do come ahead of our boundary. They might be ill. They might have a very big emotional day. Something bad happened, and we have to be able to accommodate our children in that respect, but also then clearly communicate and say, look, there was a crisis, so I had to open and change my boundary for the situation. But now that things are back to normal, now the boundary is back in place. So there are 7 types of boundaries. The first one is a mental boundary, and that is where we have the freedom to have our own thoughts and values and opinions, and we have the right to those. And then to respectfully say that I hear you, but I don't agree with what you're saying. I don't agree with this point of view, but I don't have to agree, and you don't have to convince me. The next one is an emotional boundary. So an emotional boundary is so important, and I think I have not met a lot of people that are able to put down good emotional boundaries. And that is when someone is overwhelmed and they come to you for support. And even though you are burnt out and you are unable to help them, you push yourself even further to the detriment of yourself and your family.
It's
so
empty tank thing, hey, it's like, you know, you got an empty tank and you're not doing well, but now you have to be a support for somebody else.
Yes, and that counts for everyone in our family as well. So an emotional boundary is, as much as I want to support you right now, I do not have the emotional capacity. In terms of material, is the physical, the monetary boundaries. So I already lent you money last week, so not again right now. Well, I'm unable to give to you right now. And I'm looking at this money or material one, and I'm reminded of an experience I had a couple of weeks ago, where someone came to me begging. It was a beggar. And I said no. I didn't even make a thing about it. I just said no. And he went off at me in very colorful language about me not wanting to give him any money. But because this is my boundary, you know, and I'm safe within my boundary about where I give and whom I give to, I didn't have to react because I know what my personal boundary is with regards to that. Then there are internal boundaries, and again, a difficult one, and I think especially for women, is internal boundaries. We just keep adding and saying yes to our family, and we're exhausted. So this is about self-regulation. And so how much energy have I spent on others versus how much energy have I spent on myself? And an example of this is I have been social all week. I need the weekend to myself. And how often don't we make excuses, you know, that we feel guilty and we make some of the other excuse for not being able to attend some of the other function. And instead of just being honest, I mean, we don't have to explain ourselves. No, I cannot attend. Thank you for inviting me. I will not be able to attend. Oh, conversational. And I know a lot of families have this one. Certain topics are just not discussed, politics and sometimes religion. So these are things that we just not talk about. And we prefer to not be part of either a specific topic or a particular conversation. You know, when there's a conversation happening that infringes on our values, to be able to say, I'm going to excuse myself. I don't want to be part of this conversation. A physical boundary, and this is a hard one, especially when you have little ones. I easily get sensory overload, and especially noise, and then touch becomes too much for me. It was harder when my children were little, but now that they are older, I can say to them, I prefer not to be touched right now. Or, and this is also such an important boundary that we have to respect from our children. If they don't want to hug strangers, and then to make them feel guilty about not wanting to hug an auntie or an uncle that they are uncomfortable with. We have to respect our children's boundaries as much as we have respect for ourselves. So if our children say, I don't like hugging people, teach them a different way to greet people respectfully. They don't have to greet people with a hug. And then time boundaries. So if we are needed and we are willing to go, but then we say, I can help you, but I can only stay 30 minutes. So those are the 7 boundaries.
So I'd like to just jump in there before we carry on. And, with boundaries, it's important to understand that nobody has no boundaries, right? We either have healthy boundaries or we have poor boundaries. And the thing with boundaries is that they can always be renegotiated. They don't need to stay a certain way. And we get 3 types of boundaries, which I think is very important to understand from the offset in terms of what the boundary looks like. So you get a diffuse boundary, which think of a sieve with very big holes in it, and you're at the center of that. And a diffuse boundary just lets everything in. So to the point where you're totally overwhelmed in the center of that place because you've let everything in. It's too big. The openings are too big. And you're not clear on what you accept and what you don't accept. Because a boundary is simply this. What is me and what is not me? What is my property line? Where does my property line end? Where's my gate? Is my gate open? Is my gate closed? And so this is how we renegotiate boundaries. So very often when there's been trauma or we just don't come from a background where there's been proper boundaries instilled, we are going to have that diffuse boundary. We don't know when to say no. We take on too much. We give away too much. We just operating from that place of maybe pleasing or overcompensating or whatever it may be. Then we also get the rigid boundary. Now that rigid boundary doesn't let anything in and doesn't let anything out, right? So it keeps in the bad and it keeps out the good. So that rigid boundary is often when people enter their healing journey and now they've had enough of people taking advantage, people pleasing, whatever it is, and they've put this rigid boundary up and nobody's getting in here. I'm protecting myself, and so we find it very hard then to open up again because we're not in a safe place. So often then as we heal, we need to renegotiate that boundary to how big can I open my door? What do I let in? What do I let out? How do I treat people? How do I allow people to treat me? And now we're sort of working out what this looks like. And then we get to the clear boundary. The clear boundary is I understand what my boundaries are. I understand what I'm going to allow, what I'm not going to allow. And so then I know what kind of limits to put in place. So in all these different boundaries, like even the ones that you've mentioned, think of those 3 boundaries types and think of which one have I put up in those areas. So even with our kids, we can look at what our kids go through, what they experience, what they let in, what they don't let out. If we are not modeling that to them, what does a clear boundary look like? What does a healthy boundary look like? They're not going to understand what a boundary is. And so again, like you said in the beginning, it's that consistency around boundaries. And you know, there's also a lot of myths around boundaries, you know, why people don't set good boundaries. You know, and if we look at Dr. Henry Cloud's book on boundaries, it's an awesome book. It really lays everything out from a very nice biblical perspective. But I'll just quickly give you some myths around boundaries. If I set boundaries, I'm being selfish. Okay. From a biblical perspective, boundaries are a sign of disobedience, right? Because the Bible gives us this, or people think this thing, we should have a lack of boundaries. We should always be available to everyone. We should always be giving, right? If I begin setting boundaries, I will be hurt by others. Or if I set boundaries, others will be hurt. Right? So that's the other thing. Even with our children, right? We're so concerned about how they're going to feel if we say no to that device time, or and do we want to put up with that? You know, that kind of thing. Then boundaries means I'm angry, you know, which isn't. And anger is a sure sign that our boundaries have been violated, even for our children. That anger that we feel inside, you know, if we say yes, but internally it's no, it actually negates that yes. And it can breed anger because we've actually violated our own boundary by allowing something we shouldn't have, right? And then we look at boundaries that cause guilt. You know, we feel guilty when we have to set that boundary and that sort of thing. And then also we think that boundaries are permanent. And then you're afraid of burning your bridges. But like I, you know, explained, that healing process is, there's a process to setting healthy boundaries, and there is a time for that rigid boundary so that we can decide what it is that's good for us, you know, and what is my boundary, you know. So it's a very important part of the process. So I'll give back to you on that note.
Yeah, you know, and that is a very important thing I've had to learn in my marriage, is that, and it speaks to the negotiation of boundaries we just spoke about earlier, is that you know, two people can grow up in the same culture, in the same church, and have different boundaries about certain issues and topics. And we cannot just assume that what we think a boundary in a relationship should be is the same for everyone. So it is really important, I think, in all our relationships, in intimate and close relationships, that those boundaries are understood, because how much conflict happens because, example, finances. We don't have the same ideas and boundaries around how money should be spent. So those should be negotiated from an early perspective. And then it makes it so much easier to then filter it down to our children.
See, that's the one thing I find a lot in relationships. You know, when you're working with people, you actually realize what people don't realize is that, and it's the same because we're talking about our kids here. If we do not communicate those boundaries, if we do not lay down, this is what it looks like in our marriages, in our relationship with our kids, we need to set that boundary right from the start, so that there's no misconception, there's no confusion, there's no misunderstanding around how things are going to work. And also we need to remember, if you think of a boundary as two circles, right? Our boundaries are going to overlap like that. So a healthy boundary has that small overlap in the center where you can't see, but yeah, you know what I mean. It's got that overlap in the center, but it's only an overlap. It doesn't constitute the whole circle. The other half of that circle, or 3/4 of that circle, is your individuality. And it's the same with our kids, right? We need to have a sense of togetherness, but we also need to have a sense of separateness where we can be an individual. So when we smother our kids when we not giving them, you know, enough space, if, you know, it's not healthy, because eventually those circles look like that. And there's too much togetherness and too little individuality. And so that doesn't help the process either. So when it comes to that parental line, if you want to think of it, there's the parental line, and here's the children, here are the parents. What's very important now, you know, as we get to talking about the discipline part of this as well, is that parental alliance. So if parents aren't aligned in their boundaries concerning the children and discipline and that sort of thing, it's going to cause a huge problem, because those children are not going to understand what's happening. And then even within that parental boundary, we need to allow our children a little bit of room into that space, not too much, just enough where they feel part of this process. So even when it comes to setting boundaries, can we sit down with our kids and talk about it? Can we negotiate what they're happy with, you know, in the home, what is their take on it, you know, and that sort of thing, which is an authority type of parenting. It's a healthy parenting, is to get their say on things. Okay, so
Yes,
back to you.
I think I remember also that as our children grow and as they become older, you know, when they become teens, it's important to allow them that room to develop their own personalities. So that bit that we allow need to grow, and as they become adults, you know, we need to shift those the tangle or entanglement in a way that we don't interfere with their relationships and their process of being an adult. It's
yeah, and that process is called differentiation, right? Because as our kids enter adolescence and start to move towards adulthood, there's a differentiation process that takes place, and we need to allow that, because that process is leading to a separation from us to move towards being independent adults. And that's often also the time where their peers become more important, in a sense.
yes.
You're not so important anymore. But it's a very natural process, and we need to allow that. You know, if we look at systems, family systems theory, that's a very important thing, because otherwise there's going to be enmeshment, and our children need to learn how to separate themselves from our emotions, from our stuff, to start to focus on their life. Otherwise, they enter adulthood having too much enmeshment with their family of origin, and it's going to be very hard for them to start their own nuclear family with their own values, with what they believe is right and those things, because we never allowed them that process to decide, what do I believe? What are my values? You know, do I agree with my parents? We can't impose our values on our kids. You know, we have to give them a healthy space.
Yes, and the teenage years are such a wonderful opportunity to have healthy discussions about, you know, about this. And if you have created that safe environment for them, they will come and have more conversations with you, and they will come and tell you, you know, if they are wondering about things that are different to what they've grown up with. You know, they're out in the world, they are exposed, and they to things that they might not have dealt with in the past. So you want it to be safe for them to come and talk to you about those and have a healthy discussion about it. I remember during the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial, you know, people chose sides, and they were they were very opinionated about whichever side they chose. And I remember my children came to me and they said, "Oh, you know, whose side are you on? Whose side are you on?" And it was a great opportunity for me to say, well, you know, as a mediator, I could explain in this instance beautifully what a mediator is that I don't get to choose sides. But come, let's talk about the values. You know, why do you choose this person over that person? What in the trial has made you think that you want to align with that person or that person? It was a really wonderful opportunity to discuss that with our children. But even more so, Tammy, if we don't have that safe environment, our children are not going to come to us when they are in trouble. And I have a policy with my children. They have a free pass. When they go out and they are with their friends, rather phone me and say, "Mom, I'm in trouble," than be too scared to call me. Rather let me come and fetch you or help you than having to visit you in a morgue or in the hospital or in a police cell. So as they get older now and they have more autonomy and they have to make decisions and choices when I'm not around, you know, we have that get out of jail free opportunity for them to say, "Look, Mom, I'm in trouble." And it is wonderful to see that, you know, they do phone me. They phone me and say, "Mom, I'm not comfortable here. I don't want to stay over here anymore, or I don't want to be at this place anymore. Can you come fetch me?" I have dealt with a situation in my trauma counseling space where I've had to assist a young lady of 25 who was too scared to phone her parents. She needed a family member to be with her, to assist her. She went through a really, really bad experience, but she was too scared to phone her parents. And she had no one to call. And can you imagine for your children, you know, them being frightened, whether they're 25 or 15, in a place where something like a police station or a hospital, and they're all by themselves and they're so scared and frightened already about what happened, but on top of that they're even more frightened to phone you as a parent.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we move on to discipline?
Yes.
So discipline is a touchy subject at times. Everyone has their own opinion about it. But I think the more control we want, it speaks of our own fears, right? When we want to control the outcome of anything, it is because we are afraid of what could happen. And sometimes it is the fear of having to clean up the mess. That can also be a fear. But discipline should not be about imposing control. It is about guiding, very much about guiding. And it's done with love and teaching through consequences, and then nurturing the values that shape our children's character. So, you know, parenting consciously is working with natural consequences. Sometimes I joke that, you know, sometimes the natural consequences is a natural outflow of my reaction. But you know, again, if something happens, it focuses on teaching our children responsibility. It focuses on teaching decision making, the cause and effect. So, you know, my reaction as a cause, as an effect to the cause. So instead of imposing external punishments, consequential discipline enable children, to learn from the outcome of the choices that they've made, in a more natural and logical manner. Having said that, if the behavior continues and the same thing happens over and over, you're going to have to sit and look at how are we going to address this now? Because, say, for example, because I have teens, there is poor behavior when they've gone out. And I'm using this as an example, not saying that my children did this. They're always very upset if I mention their private business. But as an example, I mean, this is something that happens to teens. If they're exposed to drinking, as an example, and you have the responsible conversation about it, and but now this behavior continues. So for me, the natural consequences that's happening is I'm no longer going to trust you. I'm no longer going to be able to let you go to a party or to let you go out with your friends if this is the behavior that continues. And for me, it is important, the boundary. It is important to communicate clearly, but it's, second chances and third and fourth chances with our children are so exceptionally important. So also to say to them, well, I can no longer trust you to allow you to roam as freely as you did in the past. So for a time period, we're gonna have to stop this or change our rules around going out until such a time that we can try again. And whether it's, a month or 2 or 3 months, just say, okay, there's been good behavior for this term. Let's try again.
Yeah, it's like giving them the opportunity to redeem themselves,
Yes.
Because even as adults, we have missteps. We mess up and we do something wrong. It doesn't mean that we are untrustworthy. It means
Yes.
we messed up, and we need to look at all the evidence for the fact that we are trustworthy versus that one mess up. So that's also very important, is to have a look in that instance as well, is where have our children been responsible, and is the ultimate truth that they can't be trusted? Is that really the ultimate truth, or is it, no, generally they can be trusted, they messed up? So it's very important as well to weigh all of this up in the process, like have a court case, of evidence.
Yes. And I think you said it so beautifully there, Tammy, that your child is not trustworthy. It's so important that we don't attack their character, and rather talk about the behavior. Your behavior cannot be trusted. It's not that and again, trust is a big thing. Do I trust my child to do brain surgery? Most definitely not. But do I trust them to be able to go to the shop and back without getting into any trouble? Perhaps. So yes, talking about the behavior in conscious discipline is very important. It's the behavior that needs to be addressed, and not the character of the child. So it is also important, again, to communicate clearly. So how do we know what is good and acceptable behavior and what is not, and how do we communicate this to our children? So I have shared with you the link of a website where you can identify your values. It helps you to identify your values, and you will share that in the notes. So the listeners can go to the click on the website and look at the different values that that we have and values we want in our families. And from there, we then narrow them down to 5. And those are the values that we then want to live by. And those are the values that we want to instill in our children. And I sound like a stuck record, but think about the long run. Think about your child when they're 18, 19, 21 years old, and they have to go out into the world on their own. What are the things that are important for you to go with your child so that they can be a responsible individual able to contribute to society? So I'm going to use family as an example. That is one of my big values, is family. So then you take this value and you sit with it and you look at, what does family mean to you? So for example, for me, family means we have each other's back, which means that if my child phones me in the middle of the night and say, "Mom, please come fetch me," I've got their back. I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to go and fetch them. But that also means to me that when my kids are at school and on the playground and something happens, they're going to be there for their sibling. They're going to have each other's back. And how we then look at that in terms of consequences. So the consequences mostly in my house, at the very least, results in uncomfortable conversations. And I always joke about it, because the teens hate uncomfortable conversations. They hate to have.
They do.
Yeah. So then, if the kids were at an event together or somewhere and something happened and they didn't have each other's back, they didn't look out for each other, one of them are inevitably going to be hurt and disappointed, and the trust between them is going to be damaged, and there will have to be repairs done to that trust relationship. So in our uncomfortable conversation session, we will sit down as a family and talk about, exactly how did we feel, when we were maybe left behind, when we were accosted by a group of other kids and my brother or sister didn't have my back and stood there with me. How did I feel in that moment? What is it that went through my mind? What is it that I would have liked them to do? And even, values and difficult conversations or uncomfortable conversations can go the other way around as well. I want my kids to come to me and say, "Mom, you didn't show up for me in this way. Here is how I felt when you talked about me on a podcast for the whole world to see and to hear." That type of thing. So it's important that it is always a conversation and that it can go both ways. So yes, so we started with identifying your core values and then the defining of each of these values. And then, of course, we talked about age appropriate. So what we would say to a teenager versus a middle schooler versus a toddler about what family means and what family values are, and having each other's back is going to look different. And it's awesome to involve your kids in the process. Let them share their ideas. What does family mean to them? What is something they would like to see in the values? What is something that they need in terms of the values? What do they need in terms of family? And then keep it positive. Instead of saying, don't be rude, it's rather practice kindness and respect. That if we hear, I mean, that this happens often, especially with teenagers. They have disagreements, loud disagreements, and I suppose at any age, and then to sit with them and say, was that behavior kind? Do you think you could have said that in a different way that would have perhaps gotten you a better result or a long-term result? And then be specific, especially when children are young. You have to make it practical for them, and they have to understand what the consequences are when something happens, for not following the rules. So an example for honesty is, honesty builds trust, as an example. For the little ones, you can have a great visual art practice. One of our clients had a wonderful idea of how she was going to implement this with their little ones, with making pictures, and they can stick it up in their room. It's something that could be really meaningful to them, that's age appropriate. But even when they're older, have a project together, have a collage, a family collage that represent your family values. I mean, the bane to so much of our parenting problems is consistency. The consistency to enforce the rules, the consistency to say that because of the repeated behavior, I said that I can't trust you, or I can't trust your behavior at parties, and therefore for the next term there won't be any. But children can nag and nag and nag till kingdom comes. But to be consistent. And years ago, I heard this beautiful line that has done me so well in all the years of parenting. And it says that it merely says asked and answered. And sometimes I forget, and then I start getting annoyed, and it's like, I remember, it works so well. You have asked, I have answered. The conversation is over. And then to continue to have an open dialogue about rules, as our children get older. So if you have a rule, they have to be, we used to have a rule that they have to be in by sunset. The children must be at home. But now, as they get older and they move in packs, we've talked about, okay, so perhaps not exactly at sundown, but if you are out after dark, it has to be in a group of 3 or more, for all of them. It has to be in a group so that there is some form of safety, if you can call it that.
So I just want to jump in there.
Please do.
From my side, I just want to sort of explain, these disobedience and defiance, right? And so versus maybe they just don't understand, or they weren't quite sure of the instruction and that sort of thing. So I just want to say disobedience is only when you know what to do, how to do it, haven't forgotten, and are able to do it, but choose not to do it. So therefore, the child refuses to carry out realistic instructions, right? They won't leave their toy when you say, tidy up your toys. So there's a defiance and a disobedience there. So we need to recognize that also in our children when we're looking at discipline and what's necessary. And then, like you mentioned, the age appropriate, seeing parents with a 3-year-old give them a whole string of instructions like this, and then want to punish them, naughty corner, whatever it is that they use because they didn't do the last 3 instructions. A 3-year-old cannot remember all those instructions. Even a 7-year-old can't remember a whole string of instructions. They're only going to remember the first 3. That's proven. The brain's going to say, I'm only going to remember the first 3. So in the morning, we're rushing out and we're giving our kids, and they only do 3 of those things. And then we're like, what's going on? So we need to just also be very mindful to the kind of instructions we're giving our kids as well in the process. And I'm sure we'll talk about that as we look at sort of some ways we can bring in discipline. But evergreen parenting has a really, really nice tool that they use for children, where especially your younger children, where the family gets together and sits around the table and they create an umbrella of protection. And so what you can explain to them is Jesus is our protection, just like he covers us, and he looks after us. He's our umbrella. These rules, or maybe as you call them, values, are there to protect us as a family. And so when we can remember all these things, so say your umbrella has, so you said 5 rules, which is quite nice, or values. It's a segment of 5. And you sit down together as a family and you make that umbrella, and you make each one a different color, and you let them paste it, and you put the values on there, and you put it somewhere where they can see it. And in that process, you discuss when this value is violated or it's not met, whether it's the kids or it's mommy and daddy, what do you think should happen? So if mommy and daddy forget that there's no shouting in the house, let's just say, for example, or we need to be kind to each other, the child needs to point that out. And then they need to be allowed to have an input on what's the consequence for that. So this is part of bringing them into a process to understand about these values and that lovely visual that we have, that we can actually remind them that which value did you break, or which rule did you break, and what did we discuss is the consequence for that. And so that's also a very nice way to help them to take responsibility for what they've done, versus you saying, oh, look what you've done, whereas you bring them in and let them have a look at what's happened, and then understand that they were actually part of this process to decide what's going to happen when that value is violated, for example.
Absolutely. And I like that visual of the umbrella, because it is there to protect us.
Mm-hmm.
And also to keep us together as a family. It's a beautiful representation. Yeah. So to just bring all of that in terms of values together, it is about identifying what our values are. And it is good to do it every now and again. Every couple of years, just check in, because we are human. We are people who keep growing and developing. And therefore, it gives us the opportunity to relook, are these values still applicable to who we are today as a family? So look at our values, then unpack it and see what is it about this value of a family or kindness, honesty that is important to us. And then let's look at what are the consequences if we don't follow the values that we have put together as a family.
Mm. Okay. So just another nice tip, with regards to that, where kids have actually got an input, it's another concept from evergreen parenting, where the kids actually come up with different types of disciplines, and I call them disciplines, but they actually like feed the dog for a week, or vacuum the carpet, or clean the toilet, put out the rubbish, or I'm going to make my sister's lunch, I'm going to make mom a cup of tea. They come up with different disciplines, and what you do then is you write those all down, but you have quite a few different ones, and you print them out and you cut them out like little slips of paper, and you put them in a little bag, and it's called a sorry bag. And so when something has happened, they've maybe broken, let's just call it broken, a house rule, or there's been an incident. This works really well for younger kids. Obviously, with your teenagers, you're going to have more complicated tasks, but it also helps if they can decide what's going to happen if they break a rule. You can take my phone for 2 days. That can be negotiated. But for the little ones, this actually makes it an exercise where they again take responsibility. So what they do is they dip their hand in the little bag and they pull something out. And so whatever they pull out of the bag is what they have to do. So beforehand, it's decided this is what's going to happen. So it almost becomes a play. And so they're learning through that play. And they've actually had a say in that. So there's no arguing about it, or a why must I, or a that, because they were part of putting that little pack together.
So it empowers them.
Yeah, it's a very, very nice idea, to help them take that responsibility for that. Because then they can't say, oh, no, I don't want to feed the dog. But you say, no, that's yours. You put that in there. Yeah, so they have to then take responsibility for that chore, or whatever it is has been put in there.
What I like about it is that it's a form of restitution or recompense for what has happened.
Yeah, it's a very nice idea. I really like it. Yeah.
Okay.
So is there anything else you want to add?
No, that is what I have on discipline and boundaries.
Okay, all right. So just in closing, I just want to add a few things. So when we're looking at discipline and boundaries, we need to remember there's a correct behavior by the parent and there's a incorrect behavior from the parent. And either way that the parent is going to respond to the child, there's going to be a behavior that responds from the child, and it's either going to be a good response or it's going to be a bad response. And so we have these different areas that we need to consider. How are we going to speak to our kids? So if there's emotionally immature behavior, how are we going to negotiate that? What is it age appropriate? All those things. We look at the inability to do things and accidents. They forget things. They can't concentrate. We need to consider all these things, and is there a real problem there? So I always also say, when your kids are acting up, are they hungry? Are they tired? Are they out of their routine? We can't just punish them or say, oh, you're being so naughty. Just run through your checklist, especially for whatever age they're at, and just see, is it something you're doing? Have you disturbed their routine? Is it the environment? Are they tired? Like, I don't know if you've ever heard of HALT. It's us, that we use that as adults. Am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? Because those are sometimes why we respond the way we do. So if we got to do a checklist for ourselves before we blow up, or we're trying to put our finger on it, we need to kind of do the same for our kids. You know, and then we look at irresponsibility with tasks, money, time, privileges, and belongings. Attention-seeking behavior, misbehavior towards others, and again, that disobedience and defiance, which we need to take into account, and any form of abnormal behavior. So we need to really just have a look at what is going on with our kids before we decide to punish them, and then think about those age-appropriate limits for them.
Absolutely.
And there's plenty of material out there. But there's one area, just before we close, one to just address, which I thought is very important, and that is manipulation. You know, our kids do try to manipulate us. And
Yes.
we also manipulate our kids. So I just want to share this quickly. Like, why do we manipulate? Okay, and this comes from, so I'm using Evergreen Parenting because it's a really, really nice series put together by Hetty Brits. And it's really an awesome tool, you know, to help you in your parenting. And she's got 2 books out as well around this topic. And I'll pop the books in the notes if it's something you might be interested in getting. So let's just quickly look at this. Why do we manipulate? So why do children manipulate authority figures? Because they have a sinful, selfish nature, because they try to be in control rather than to accept authority, because they don't understand what their role in the family is, because they have needs and don't know how else to get the needs met. So what are we looking at? Your food, attention, touch, acknowledgement, autonomy, peer group acceptance, playtime, rest time, sleep. So we're looking at, and you know, the first one is because they have a sinful and selfish nature. It's not a unusual thing to say, because we have a sinful and selfish nature as well. We need the Holy Spirit to help us. But for kids in the beginning, it is actually, they're very egocentric, right? It's about them, and it's about what they need. And so even these things we need to take into consideration. What do they need? So sometimes it's also because they have an underdeveloped emotional intelligence, because boundaries are flexible and mobile. That means there's no consistency. They don't understand the boundaries. They reject authority, and that can be also because you're parenting with power rather than parenting in the right way, and because they are angry. And because it works, right? Because if we're going to give into it, it's going to work. So why do we manipulate, right? We manipulate because sometimes there's more money than time, right? Because they don't know how else to handle it. So I'm talking about the parents now. Because they feel guilty, because they have low emotional intelligence. And we're looking at a lot of things that come into play. Because they think that children should not cry, wait, get angry, or disappointed. And so there's a lot in there, like even that instant gratification thing, where we can't teach our children to wait for something. And I have seen this time and time again, when parents have that instant gratification, the children will learn to manipulate through that to get what it is that they need. If you're not teaching your child to wait, right? Because they've lost authority, right? Probably because it's power parenting. There's no authority in the home. Because they don't understand authority. So we need to learn what that looks like, what's healthy authority. Because they're too scared to exercise their authority over the children. And then because they don't respect the child's needs. How important is that? We need to respect the child's needs. And because they never had a better example. So sometimes we know we didn't have an example of what discipline or healthy discipline looks like. So we don't know what that looks like. It minimizes conflict, right? Because the parent might not have a relationship with the child. They haven't taken time to build that relationship. And then manipulation because it works, right? Yes. So just to explain that quickly. So you give in by letting the child get their own way. Okay, we're looking at now the incorrect behavior by the parent. You pacify and negotiate until the child is satisfied. You hit or shout, threaten, call the child a baby, tell the child they are embarrassed by them. So how many times is it embarrassing me? Don't do that. You know, what are people going to say? Or look, everybody's looking at us, you know, that kind of thing. React to irrational words. So if the child threatens to run away, then the parent threatens to help them pack their suitcase. Now, I'm guilty of that. I did that to my little girls. One day I'm packing my bag. I'm like, okay, come, let's go pack your bag. You know, it's like you don't think the effect of that on the children. And a lot of children do that. I want to pack my bag.
Yeah.
You get emotional with a child, right? You copy the silly tactics of the child. So think of a tantrum, for example. You take the accusations or attacks personally and you ignore the child, right? So just an outcome of that for the child is they learn that manipulation is right, especially when they get their own way. They receive the payoff for the behavior, and so they will do it again, right? If you allow that to continue. They lose respect for the parents. They get selfish and feel entitled to have all their wishes satisfied, especially if you're giving in and there's no, you know, setting that gratification boundary. They step over others' boundaries. They become master manipulators, and they use emotions instead of words to make their needs known. And then they feel hopeless and feel like the parent doesn't understand them. So manipulation is quite a very interesting area to look at, because it does definitely play out, you know. Yeah. So we need to sort of teach our children through the way that we respond to that. So, you know, we need to discern between real needs and what is manipulation, first of all, and then meet their needs in an appropriate way. Remove the reward that was usually offered when manipulation was used. So that means we need to renegotiate this thing, and we need to start doing it the right way. Point out the techniques of manipulation. So once again, we can say, I recognize what you're doing. You know, we have this conversation. And again, here comes the boundaries. Establish boundaries for an appropriate way to speak and express emotions. And then we need to be consistent. You know, and this will then teach our children, you know, to have gratitude, what manipulation is, to respect the boundaries of others, to accept no. This is a big thing. We're talking about boundaries, to accept no. And then help them to develop those boundaries. They can experience trust and security with us, because we don't have a power play and a power struggle going on. And it helps them develop emotional intelligence. So there are many areas where we just really need to pay attention as parents, and nobody has a handbook. We know that. But we just need to consider there are these different areas where, when we are going to look at discipline, that we just do it in a healthy way.
Yes.
Yeah.
That so valuable.
So I will put these little books on the link for the parents if they're interested. I was I am an evergreen parenting facilitator, although I haven't done much of this in a while, but it's something I often use to help parents, because it's just explained in such a really nice, simple way. I do advise that for parents with little ones and with older children. It's a really, really nice resource. So, Isolet, before we go, is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that Hetty Britt series is really a wonderful series and worth looking at for parents. And please do have a look at the links that Tammy will be posting. It is Hetty has done amazing work in the sphere of parenting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you all to all those that have been listening, been watching. Next week we're going to have our last part in the series, and we're going to be looking at communication, right, Isolet?
Communication and connection.
Communication and connection. Okay, so that's our last part, and then we'll take a bit of a break, and then we'll be back with some more good stuff. But yeah, until then, so thank you very much for your time again, Isolet, and this valuable information. And I encourage you all to also just check out the link on the values. I think it's also a very nice resource to have just in general. And
Yes.
yeah, so until next time.
Yes, thank you so much.